Hey Dice Rollers, my name is Mr. Stump, and welcome to another episode of Tabletop Tactics with BNC Gaming. Today on Tabletop Tactics, we're going to be talking about primary objective scoring and why you should think about it more in your games of Warhammer 40,000. Let's remember that Warhammer 40,000 is a game about scoring points. It seems a lot like chess, or games that are about capturing material at first, but once you play through games and you learn the rules, you'll come to understand that the way you win games of Warhammer 40,000 is actually by scoring points and not by taking your opponent's material. There are 3 categories for scoring points in games of Warhammer 40,000. Category 1 is battle ready. If your army is based and painted, you'll get 10 points in competitive games of Warhammer 40,000. The second category for scoring points in competitive games of Warhammer 40,000, called secondary objectives, awards you a maximum of 40 points for completing randomly drawn tasks from a deck of cards, or by selecting 2 fixed secondary objectives to complete from a small pool of options. Finally, primary objectives awards up to 50 points in competitive play, and therefore comprises the highest single category of scoring available to players in competitive games of Warhammer 40,000. Primary objectives are scored by possessing a higher level of control within 3 inches of primary objective markers. Level of control is determined by adding together the objective control characteristics of the models within range of a primary objective marker. The player with the highest objective control sum within range of an objective marker is said to have a higher level of control. Players compare their level of control for each objective marker in the command phase beginning on turn 2 and are awarded points for the primary objectives they control. The one exception to this rule is that uniquely, the player who goes second has the advantage of scoring primary objectives at the end of the 5th battle round rather than in their command phase. Because secondary objective scoring only awards a maximum of 40 points in competitive play, the more predictable and lucrative primary objective scoring system should be your focus if you are just starting out in games of Warhammer 40,000. Now that we've talked about how you score points in games of Warhammer 40,000, and we've established that primary scoring should be your main concern, especially when you're starting out, let's talk about the goals you should have for yourself in every game of Warhammer 40,000 that you play. First, you want to ensure that any primary objectives that exist within your deployment zone are under your control for the whole game. You don't want your opponent sneaking in there and compromising that objective, and you certainly don't want them scoring points from that objective. Think about that as your moneymaker all game long, the one thing you can count on. Secondly, you want to expand out from your deployment zone and capture any primary objectives that exist in the neutral zone of play, or no man's land as it's called. And lastly, you want to try to make sure that your opponent cannot control those objective markers. You want to start by compromising their ability to control objective markers in the neutral zone, and then you may even want to expand that concept and wrestle control away from their home objective to increase the gap between your score and their score. Now that we've talked about how primary objective scoring works and discussed a few goals that you need to have for yourself when you enter games of Warhammer 40,000, let's look at some examples of how players typically trade resources to capture primary objectives. And what we'll find is that while the primary objective scoring system seems balanced, it in fact gives a preference to the player that goes second in games of Warhammer 40,000 because it allows them to score at the end of their turn in the 5th battle round. Okay, so in this example, I've set up a basic board that might seem similar to something you would run into in a game of Combat Patrol, okay? So when you're starting out games of Warhammer 40,000, you probably aren't going to have a lot of material. It's best to start games, in my opinion, at that 500 point mark, or even when you're learning how to play, you might even go lower than that. I would suggest doing this until you build up your sense of the game, the way that the tempo of the game works, when you figure out how you can build lists to be successful, so on and so forth. After you've learned some of those basic lessons, then go ahead and move up to 750, 1,000, and start pushing towards that 2,000 point tournament standard. Now, at BNC Gaming, we run a school club, and so we start lots of new players out at this 500 point level. I think this is a great place to learn the game because it strips away a lot of the extras and reduces the game to its most basic components. So we're going to take a look at a couple of those components here as they relate to primary scoring. You'll see that in my setup here, I've got two teams, Team A and Team B. Each one of these teams is made up of 5 units of breachers. So if you're not familiar with what breachers are, they're kind of a troop unit in the Tau Codex, and they're an assault unit. They can move, they can shoot after they advance, and they have a lot of shots at relatively high strength. It's very easy for a unit of breachers to clear off guardsmen, some Eldari units, and really anything that has that toughness 3, 5-up save profile. Now, breachers are awesome because they can punch up quite a bit if you have stratagems that you want to use, and so they're a great unit to go out and score primary objectives. Now, in this example, what we're going to see is that in a normal game of Warhammer 40,000, if neither player is executing a specific strategy to give them a leg up, players are typically going to trade units trying to capture primary objectives in no man's land. So, let's look at what we've got here. On this table, we have 2 objective markers in no man's land. The green circle is the radius, if you will, from the center of the objective marker where you can score points. So here we've got the area where a player can position units with an OC characteristic greater than 0 to control these objectives in their command phase. Now, as I said earlier in the video, players are going to score in those command phases. So, player A, if he had first turn, would move breachers out onto the center objectives in order to score them in the turn 2 command phase. Player A is probably going to move some second lines of breachers up so that on following turns, those can also be sent out to those objective markers in the neutral zone so that player A can continue scoring should anything happen to those units. Player A is also going to leave a unit on their home objective in order to maintain points from that objective all game long. Now, this is typically how games of 40K play out should no player have an extreme example of strategy. Player B is likely going to respond to player A by moving units out of their own, staging further units, and then in the shooting phase in this example, removing player A's units from these neutral zone objectives. So in this way, player B is going to steal these objectives away from player A, and on player A's second turn, they will not score any primary points from the neutral zone objectives. This puts a cap on player A's points and gives player B the advantage in scoring primary. Now, what you're going to see as we play this out is that player B has a couple of big advantages in this system. The first advantage is, because player A has to move out and take objectives first, player B has the opportunity to remove material before player A. Now, earlier I said that Warhammer 40,000 isn't actually about taking your opponent's material. It's about scoring points. This is still true. However, it's very difficult to score points if you have no material. And so, in a roundabout way, 40K does become a game where you're going to be trading resources with your opponent to get a leg up on material. But remember, this is only because you have to have material to score points. If you take all of your opponent's material but one unit, and you refuse to use any of your units to score points, but your opponent manages to do so, you'll lose every game of Warhammer 40,000 you ever play. So let's return back to the example here. Player A is then going to be forced on turn 2 to move out and take this objective marker. In a similar vein to what player B did on their first turn, On player A's second turn, player A is going to shoot these breacher units off of the objective, ensuring that player B also does not score these points on their second turn. Player B moves out, removes player A, and now player A is out of material, and we could think that player B is likely going to score out the rest of the game to their maximum potential. So you can see that because player A has to move out, in this perfectly balanced trading game, player B is going to have the advantage because they went second. And this brings me to a point that I just want to reiterate about primary scoring. And that is that primary scoring favors the player who goes second. Now, you might ask yourself, why is it that player A moves out first? Why doesn't player A just wait for player B to move their units out, and then player A can have the advantage that player B had in this scenario? Here's why player A has to make the first move. The reason that player A has to make the first move is because at the end of the game, player B gets to score primary in a different way than player A has all game. On the fifth battle round, unique to player B is the opportunity to score points at the end of the turn after all their actions have been taken. So what that means is that player B is going to get to move out at the end of their turn and swing the point totals in their favor. So let's set up a game where both players have sort of waited until the end of the game in order to score objectives. So let's say it is player B's fifth turn. So it's the fifth battle round. These players have been trading in this game, but player A decided to wait a while to go out and grab those center objectives because player A was worried about player B removing that material that they used to go out there and grab the objectives. So here's what it's going to look like at the end of the game. This is the bottom of turn 5, the top of player B's turn 5, bottom of round 5, and player A is left on these objectives. Now, if this were a normal turn, player B would start their turn out scoring primary, they wouldn't score the center points, and they'd be restricted to the points that they gain from their home objective. But because this is round 5, what's going to happen here is player B is going to score at the end of the turn. So player B gets to move, shoot, and remove player A's units before they score. So what player B is going to get in this situation is a swing turn, where at the bottom of turn 5, player B gets to score 2 more primary objectives. Now, the point totals for primary objectives can shift depending on the mission that you're playing. How many you can capture and score is going to change as well. But in general, what you need to know from this lesson is that the fact that player B gets to score primary at the end of that fifth turn does 2 things. Number 1, it ensures that in a deadlock scenario, player B is always going to be the last person with an opportunity to jump ahead with the primary score. Secondly, because the player that goes first, in this case player A, knows that player B has that ability, it forces player A to be much more aggressive in their play in order to steal away enough of player B's material as to negate the advantage they get at the end of turn 5. So player A is going to be forced to get out there and grab objectives, forced to get out there and destroy more material than necessary so that player B can't take advantage of the privileged position they're in to have bottom of turn 5 scoring. Now that we've talked about some of the basics here, the interplay between the player that goes first and second in primary scoring, let's take a second to think about which types of units are going to serve you well in the primary scoring game. The first thing I would advise you to look at is the OC characteristic of any unit you intend to play the primary game with. If you're trying to play the primary game with a unit that, say, has 0 OC, it doesn't matter how fast that unit is, It doesn't matter how hard it hits or how durable it is. It doesn't matter what the leadership is or whatever kind of abilities it has. Because at the end of the day, your opponent can place any unit with 1 OC within range of an objective marker and steal it from you. For that reason, the OC characteristic is the most important characteristic to look at when you're trying to find those units to go out and capture primary objectives. Now, the nice thing is, just about every unit in your codex is probably going to have some OC characteristic. It's actually very rare to find a unit without any OC, so 0 OC units. So you shouldn't have too much trouble there. The second thing you might look at is whether or not a unit has abilities that trigger off of primary objectives. There are lots of units in every codex that have, 1 or 2 things that seem built for primary play. The breachers that I used in the previous example have an ability that allows them to do some re-rolling on attacks when their opponent or the targeted unit is in range of a primary objective. That screams to be played around primary objectives, and so it's your codex's way to tell you that this unit is probably going to be good for primary play. Next, what you might want to look at is the movement characteristic of your unit. I don't know if you noticed, but in our previous example of how primary play works, there was a little number between the deployment zone and the edge of that objective's radius. It was 7.25. If you challenge yourself to do a little math assignment, you'll notice that the distance between your average objective range and your deployment zone is somewhere around 7.5 inches. So if you're looking at units that you want to be able to move out and capture those objectives, particularly on turn 1 of the game, you need to be looking at units that are going to be able to move that distance or more in 1 turn of play. So these are going to be your fast skimmer type vehicles, maybe anything with the infiltrator ability, something that scout moves up and then can take their move should you get turn 1. Those types of things are going to be ideal for placing on primary objectives in the early games while the rest of your army catches up and stages. Next, you might want to think about durability. Does the unit that you want to put on an objective stand a chance of surviving your opponent's turn? If not, you might want to consider units that are very inexpensive. That way you can field lots of them without running out of material late in the game. You also might want to look at how damaging your unit is. What's its lethality? Can it quickly remove your opponent's units from the primary objective? You want to find units that can impact the game, that can move on to a primary objective, trigger abilities, steal it with OC, damage the units that are already on them so that they negate your opponent's advantage, or be so durable that they stand there and weather all the attacks of your opponents and you maintain control of those primary objectives in your command phase. So I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into primary objective scoring. I hope that if you knew about it, maybe you take it more seriously now. Maybe you learned 1 or 2 things that are going to spice up your game plan. In the next episode, I want to talk about how we can, as the player who goes first, in our list design, kind of flip the advantages that player 2 has in the primary game. Remember, if all things are equal, player 2 has a dramatic advantage. So what can we do with list design, and how can we take the benefits of being the first turn player to impose our will on the player who goes second? We'll catch you next time on Tabletop Tactics with BNC Gaming.